Hi, welcome back, Community Focus here on Channel 6 TV. I'm Kenny Fogel, your host, and we're here in Nelson County. In Nelson County, we're a little bit far away. If you've looked out the window lately, you probably don't see a seacoast anywhere. And if you're like me, you've never been on a cruise liner or anything of that nature, or the Love Boat, or we talk about that a little bit. But we got Phil Nevitt here, and he has. And I run into Phil a few nights ago at a dinner, and we was fascinated to hear some of the stories that we're talking about in your years on the open sea. So Phil, first of all, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Kenny.
And, again, what got you to the sea? What was the first thing that took you to the ocean shore?
Well, it was actually my father. My father was in the United Nations, and he had to travel all over the world. So guess what? I went along for the ride. So fortunately, I was able to go around the world in a time when you went across the Atlantic or the Pacific. You didn't take a airplane because they didn't have the range except for seaplanes.
Yeah.
So in the 50s, you went by ocean liner. So what I thought I'd do today is everybody books transportation and goes on vacations, and now with the internet, they go online to get the best deal. So rather than bore everybody with a bunch of facts and figures on what's the best price, where's the best location on the ship, and so forth, I'd maybe tell you three stories that happened to me while I was on ships over the last 60 years, and maybe get a little flavor about what it's like to be on the sea. You may have some misconceptions, and you may want to go for yourself on a vacation or a trip. The first story was, as I said, my father was in the United Nations, and one of his assignments was to go to Alexandria, Egypt. So that was the headquarters for the WHO in Africa, and he was a doctor, and it was going to be his job to get rid of all the pandemics that were in that area back in the 50s. In 1957, I was 7 years old. We lived in California. So like I just mentioned, if you wanted to go from point A to point B, you just didn't go to New York and get on a plane and land over in Europe, and then after that go over to Italy, Greece, and then to Egypt. You had to go by sea. So at that time in the 50s, the United States had their own ocean liners, and this was very common. France had their own ocean liners. Britain had, of course, you all know about the Queens. So in the United States, one of the bigger lines was American Export Lines. So at 7 years old, I went up the gangplank. And what they did in those days, and they don't do it anymore, unfortunately, due to 9/11, you had what was called a bon voyage party. And you could invite as many people as you wanted, didn't matter how many. And you were allowed to board early, 2 or 3 hours early, along with your guests. And you could go to the lounge, and you could have cocktails and hors d'oeuvres, and you could all celebrate the person leaving. And then, of course, when it was time to go, the gentleman came around with a gong, and he would say, "All those that are going ashore, go ashore." And you had just a few minutes to get off, or you were considered a stowaway. So I was in the lounge with my parents and my brother, and I was having a Shirley Temple. Now, some of you don't know what a Shirley Temple is, but if you're a youngster, that's 7-Up and grenadine or cherry juice. So for the non-alcoholic beverage for teenagers or a 7-year-old, that's a neat thing. It even had a cherry in it. And so we were sitting at the table, and after a few minutes I looked up, and there were 7 women standing around us with their hands crossed like this. And these 7 women had on gowns, and then their faces were completely covered except for their eyes. And I asked my mom, I says, these women are staring at us. And my mother says, "Philip, don't worry about it. They've probably never seen Americans before. Just let them look. That's fine." Because in the mid-50s, when you traveled, you didn't have big crowds because it was relatively new. So maybe we were the first Americans they had seen. So I didn't pay any attention to them. I asked if I could leave, and I went out on the deck. Well, they were loading cargo on the ship. In those days, if you were wealthy and you had a car, you could actually take your car and they would load it into the front of the ship. So I noticed that they were loading 6 1957 black Cadillac limos into the front hold of the ship. So I watched that operation. I thought that was pretty unique. So the ship sailed, and the first day at sea, I ran down to the ship's gift store, and they had what was called Dinky Toys. Dinky Toys preceded the Matchbook toy, and they were a little bit larger than the Matchbox cars and trucks, and they had one of a ambulance. So I bought it, and I brought it back to the cabin. And then I asked my mother if I'd go swimming. Well, there are not that many activities going transatlantic, so swimming was a big deal. So I got my trunks and I got my towel, and I went over to the pool, put my towel down, and put the Dinky Toy on the towel, and in I went. And the only other person in the pool was a boy my age, and I could see him swimming over there. And but what was different was his skin was a little darker than mine. He was very tan, and but I noticed on his left hand he had watches, Rolex watches, Cartier watches. They were all just lined up, like 6 or 7 of them on his hand. And I thought, this is really strange. So I swam over to him and I, greeted him. And young boys make friendships almost instantly, especially at that age. And I said, why do you have so many watches on your hand? And he said in perfect British English, because I like watches. And then I thought that was strange because he didn't look British. So we swam, and then after a little while he says, would you like to make a trade? I see your truck over there. I'll trade you something. I said, well, what do you got? So he went over to his towel and stuff and his clothes, and underneath his clothes he had a sterling silver dagger with ebony encrusted handle and so forth. He says, I'll trade you that for the toy. I said, sure.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. So we made the trade. So I went back to the cabin and I was all excited, and I came in and said, look, Mom, look what I got. Well, my mom is like many moms. She's like 5'4", Irish, and she says, where did you get that? I said, well, I traded it with a little boy at the pool. He says, I don't care where you got it. You cheated him. You find him on the ship and you give him back because he got the raw end of the deal. I said, well, Mom, I don't know what cabin he's in. He says, well, go down to the purser's office, which is the main check-in, like in a hotel, and describe the boy, and maybe they can tell you where he is. So I go down to the purser's office and I describe the boy and so forth. And for some reason, they knew right away who he was. And actually, he was on the top, above the promenade deck, towards the front of the ship, in one of 4 suites. So I went up there and I knocked on the door, waited, and then finally, this man appeared, and he was tall. He had to have been 6'3", 6'4".
Yeah. And
he was in flowing white robes, and he had a goatee, and he had on like a headband around his head. And all of a sudden, I noticed behind him, there were those 7 women. And they were just behind him. And then his son came by him and held his hand. I said, my mother won't let me keep this. I have to give it back. And in perfect English, he says, no. In my country, a trade is a trade, and you keep that. So I went back to my mother, and my mother really got angry. Says, I don't care who this is. I don't know who he is, but you're coming with me. So she grabs me by the hand, and she takes me down to the purser's office, And she says, I am Mrs. Nevitt. My husband is with the United Nations, and I need to find out who has this, my son made a trade, and we need to find out where this cabin is, and I need to talk to the gentleman. Well, everybody in the purser's office started laughing hilariously, and my mother just got more upset. Why are they laughing at me? And they said, well, Mrs. Nevitt, you can do what you want, but you're not going to get that dinky toy back. That boy is the Prince of Saudi Arabia, and his father is King Fahd of Saudi Arabia. True story.
Oh my goodness!
And then here is the.
I was going to ask you, do you still have that?
I sure do.
Oh, absolutely.
There's a dagger, and there it is.
Well, that is something that you want to hold on to.
But this is the kind of stuff that happens with a little boy traveling back in the 50s. Yeah.
Oh my God! Yeah, this has got some history with it there.
Yeah.
So that is fantastic. Yeah,
Right.
a little seed to go with it and everything.
That's right.
Well, yeah, I'd trade that for a dinky toy any day of the week.
That's right.
So that's a pretty good way to start out your adventure with the seas.
Right, right.
I can see where you can get addicted and want to stick around.
Right.
So later on, I mean, obviously you did more sailing
Right.
across the ocean.
Right. There was a transition from ocean liners, of course I mentioned earlier, that go from point A to point B. And that happened in 1958 was the big year. That is when the 707s started to fly across the Atlantic and the Pacific. And that signaled the decline of the ocean liner.
If you can get across in 10 hours instead of 10 days? I don't know how long it took. It
About
probably
3
took
days.
3 days.
Three to
Okay.
4 days, yeah. So at that time, because of my travels, I kept up the desire to travel, and I joined Royal Viking Line. Royal Viking Line was also part of P&O, the Peninsula and Orient Line. And when did cruising start? Well, cruising started probably when I started working there, and it was in the late, mid-70s, and a big thing happened. They built a cruise ship that was between 700 and 800 feet long, and it only carried about 600 or 700 passengers. But they designed it for slow speed. They weren't in a hurry because they wanted to travel to multiple destinations, and you would get off the ship and go on a shore excursion and then do it again and again and again. And they had more amenities, and this was the beginning of the cruise line. Now the name of that ship was the Pacific Princess. It was one of the most beautiful ships design-wise you've ever seen. And that Pacific Princess was featured in the Love Boat. Okay, so the Love Boat was in the Bahamas when I was an executive there, and every once in a while I have to go on board ship. The reason I had to leave the home office in San Francisco and go on ship is you would have movie stars, not part of the series, but movie stars just going on vacation. And people would say, well, gee, weren't they swamped with people saying, oh, can I get your autograph?
Yeah.
Actually, no. In those days, a lot of movie stars liked to go on cruise ships because the people would just leave them alone.
Yeah.
They treat them just like everybody else and gave them some anonymity. So one of those people that went on the cruise ship, we had Elizabeth Taylor, we had Gregory Peck, we had all the big stars. And my job is I'd be called from the home office to go and escort them through the cruise. And of course what was fun was, I'm nobody, nobody knows my name, but I'd have to take them to the dining room or on their shore excursions. I would go with them to be sure everything was okay. And of course then the people were all around, so I felt important because they were all around me.
Yeah.
But at this particular time we had Omar Sharif on board. By the way, Omar Sharif passed away about a year ago. Remember him from Lawrence of Arabia and other movies. And the reason Omar was there is actually he was using the ship as a form of transportation. We were going to the Bahamas, and he wanted to get off in the Bahamas because he was going to do a shoot for Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. Some of you may remember that television show. So he was doing us a favor because most people don't know this. Omar Sharif was an avid bridge player. So we had a lot of older ladies on board that would always love to play bridge. So can you imagine? He went on the ship and his job was to play bridge. And boy, did they love it. So because of my travels to Egypt, I spoke Arabic. Well, Omar Sharif was born in Alexandria, and I had been to Alexandria. Omar Sharif was a lover of horses, and so forth and so on. So in the late evenings, we would go up to the lounge, and we would have drinks, and we would talk for hours. And one day he said, by the way, are you married? I said, oh, absolutely. I says, as a matter of fact, we're allowed sometimes to bring our wives on board, and my wife is down in the cabin. She was with me on this particular trip. And he says, oh. And I said, by the way, I hate to bother you, but you're her most famous movie star. She absolutely adores your movies, and she just thinks the world of you. Would you possibly just write something on one of these cocktail napkins? And it was, like an autograph.
Yeah.
And mind you, this is 11:30 at night. And we were in tuxedos, and we kind of had our ties undone, and had a few aquavits, which is actually Norwegian vodka.
Uh-huh.
And we were filling our oats, and he says, so she thinks a lot of my movies and such. I said, yeah, she does. And he says, so she's on board? And I said, yeah. He says, well, let me go meet her. So we go down the cabin. I'm in the background, and he knocks on the door. And it was like something out of a movie set. Here comes my wife. She's in her robe. She opens up the door, and there is Omar Sharif, about 6 inches from her nose. She'll never forget it. I'll tell you what. That was just another example of cruising.
Yeah.
But maybe sometime we'll talk further about cruising.
Well, I really would.
And people tend to pay more, and they tend to get things they don't need.
Uh-huh.
So I have some great tips on how to get the royal treatment at very little cost.
Well, we'll do that. We'll have another show here soon. But one thing I do want to ask you before we do get out of here is you mentioned the Love Boat.
Yes.
How much of a boost was that to the cruise industry? Because for me and many others, that's as close as we've ever gotten to a cruise.
It was absolutely enormous. A lot of it was produced on the ship, and you could kind of tell when it was on the ship, and then they had the studios in Los Angeles. But that was like, they have said that was, even though it was a TV show, that was an example of the longest program length commercial in the history of television. Because basically you had a commercial for Princess Cruises every time you watched the show.
Well, you saw it in another direction than we saw. I mean, the Love Boat seemed like, the ideal utopia. Everybody's having a good time, but you were working. You were employed there, so
Right.
You probably saw it from just a little different angle than I would suspect that most people do.
Well, we could go into that too at some time. Usually the ratio is about 4 to 1, maybe 5 to 1. So you've got 4 employees of some kind catering to one passenger.
Really?
Between the servers in the dining room to the crew and so forth. There's a tremendous amount of behind the scenes. It's like you see these television shows about Disneyland or Universal Studios, and you see these tunnels underneath where behind the scenes all these things are going on. Same thing on a cruise line.
Yeah.
They have to sleep. They have to eat. They have to, so there's a whole world that no one ever sees.
Well, like I said, you know, I was listening to your stories the other night and today as well, fascinating, and I know we could go on for hours, but we don't have that much time, and we only have a limited amount of time here. But Phil, I do appreciate you being on here today, because like I said, I think a lot of us are highly interested in this, maybe never been on a cruise, or have been on a cruise and haven't seen the behind-the-scenes stuff, so maybe we'll get a chance to talk about all that one day, maybe get a few tips on how you might be able to go on a vacation this summer, and
Absolutely.
and maybe save a little money and have a better time. So.
Absolutely.
All right, well, Phil Nevin, I appreciate you being here today, and
Thank you,
like I
Kenny.
said, you traveled the world and landed in Bardstown, and we're very happy that you did.
Well, I am too. I'll tell you what, it's the best place to be.
All righty, Phil Nevin here with us here. Tell us a bit about what it's like on a cruise ship, or maybe on an ocean liner, or something out on the seas. And someday we'll talk even more in detail. Like I said, it's all fascinating. Stick around. A lot more fascinating stuff to come your way right here on Channel 6 TV, Community Focus. Be right back.